being here. I didn't realize it, but both of my lessons are a little bit different. This morning's had no transition between 2 points that weren't related to each other, and tonight's is going to be just a general overview of the idea of missing the obvious. Interpreting a dream here is kind of an interesting way of looking at the events that transpire in Daniel 2. This is an important text here, and part of the reason I'm bringing this up, and the punchline is, I'll just give you a spoiler alert, has to do with the intensity with which many religious people read this with the wrong impression as to what it means. It's amazing the theories that are cast about concerning this dream, its interpretation, but more so when it takes place. And so what I'm going to point out, hopefully, beyond any shadow of a doubt, as to how it applies and how we can look at it and understand it. To begin with, it's just a phenomenal thing that God never forgets his people, but he also has a sense of communication with even those who are not his people. I don't think sometimes when we read Daniel, we really get a grip on or grasp of how connected God was with Nebuchadnezzar. Let's start with the point that he has a dream, doesn't remember the dream, and I didn't have Byron read the whole thing, or you could go into a chapter and a half trying to set this up, but he has a dream, and there's argument as to whether he didn't remember it or he just really wanted to be sure that his prophets knew what they were talking about. So tell me the dream, and then I'll know you can tell me the interpretation. Well, that went over like a lead balloon, and of course they admitted, nobody tell you your dream, Chief. You've got to tell us what the dream is before we can give you some line about what it means. But nevertheless, he wasn't going to settle for that, and he was killing them left and right. In fact, the process of killing the Chaldeans and the wise men and the mystics and so forth had already begun. And this one guy came to get Daniel, and Daniel said, whoa, give me a shot at this. And so he prayed. He got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego together, and he prayed with them, and God gave him what the dream was, and then the interpretation of it. And so it's interesting, when he starts with the interpretation of what the dream was, we all are familiar with the big figure of head of gold and the silver and so forth, all the way down to the clay feet with the toes that are clay and iron mixed together. He says, "You, O King, are King of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory." And what's very noticeable at the very beginning is Daniel speaking to this king saying, I just told you your dream. Now that doesn't make Daniel cocky. As a matter of fact, if you'll go back to verse 30 as a preface to this, he tells the king, "As for me, this secret has not been revealed to me because I am more wisdom than anyone else living, but for our sakes who make known the interpretation of the king, that you may know your thoughts of your heart." Isn't it so kind of God to tell Nebuchadnezzar, I know what you were dreaming, and I'm going to send Daniel to you to let you know what you're dreaming. To me, it's a phenomenal thing that he made Nebuchadnezzar who he was, okay? And it's during the course of Daniel's time with him and being part of that kingdom and being a wise man and a high statesman in that kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar was sending troops down there and wiping out Jerusalem, his people. This is going on about the same time. But Daniel, being the guy that he was and dedicated to God, was willing to tell him, I'm not just smarter than everybody else, that's why I'm telling you this. I love this text because this is the mantra I speak, or I believe, when I teach you. When I teach you something that's not in the book, you tell me so I can get it straight. Because frankly, we're not up here to hear Jeff. Jeff's got no authority, none. The authority comes from God. And Jeff better get it right, or you better correct me, because if you don't, when you stand at judgment, you're not going to be able to say, well, Jeff told me that. And she's going to laugh. Well, maybe not, because you're not. You need to know that God is the one that's in charge of everything, and that's what Daniel told this guy. But he's standing before the king after having told him, I've given you the kingdom, is what God is telling you. God gave you this kingdom. You didn't get it yourself. Now, when you follow Nebuchadnezzar through his life, you can tell that Nebuchadnezzar, much like several of us perhaps, it takes 2 or 3 times to get the real message across, right? Sometimes you got to get turned into a cow and eat grass before it really registers. But nevertheless, whatever it takes, God's willing to do it. But isn't it amazing that God shared with this pagan king the fact that he is so mighty and so powerful because I let you be there. But not only that, I want you to know who I am and what I've got to say about you and the future of my people. And so he gives Nebuchadnezzar this insight. And so he explains down through there what this image means. And of course he goes through the telling of all of the pieces and parts of this big, huge idol. Now, what's ironic about this is people's misunderstanding about this idol, this thing that he built. And one of the big arguments that people make or try to make is giving it a long process of time so as to not concede the kingdom coming when the kingdom came. Jesus made the statement in Matthew 16, I'm going to build my church. He's telling Peter after he confessed that he's the Christ. I'm going to build my church. And Peter, I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. Verse 19. Well, the kingdom is used in direct connection with the church. And so most of us understand the kingdom and the church are one. And so therefore, that kingdom was going to come about. Now, when it came about is the key. And if you look at Mark 9:1, and this is my go-to verse with people when they start talking about how the church was a makeshift organization that just got set up because, shock of shocks, God didn't know people would reject his son, and so he had to set up a makeshift organization to go until the kingdom finally comes after the tribulation or before the tribulation. Depends on whether you're post-trib or pre-trib. All the terminology that's not biblical that comes from all this. And people will look at this and they say, and here's the catchphrase. I've got it squared off in my book. Daniel 2:44. In the days of these kings. There is a big fight among the scholars as to when Daniel was actually written. Was it back in the 600s when it was written, which makes everything he said a prediction, a prophecy of things that had not yet occurred? Or did he predict this during the era of Antiochus Epiphanes when the Seleucid kingdom was so powerful, and it's in the 300s, and he's using these illustrations as stories and myths and parables and such to explain and try to bolster the Israelite people, which of course is flatly wrong, because what one is doing when they deny this text is they're denying that Daniel wrote this as a prediction and a prophecy of things far ahead, and in doing so, it was miraculous. In fact, most of the scholars who would like to place the dating of Daniel in the 300s flatly deny there are any miracles. That's the problem. You know, if you start with the 8 priority of discussion, well, there's no such thing as miracles, you miss the Bible. Quite frankly, you miss the resurrection. You miss all the miracles Jesus did. You miss the idea that we're going to be resurrected, all these things being miraculous. And so therefore, in the days of these kings is often twisted to be something far-reaching in the far future. But if you look at the context, you will see kingdoms that rise and fall. And so therefore, when it talks about in the days of these kings, it's not talking about the days of King Nebuchadnezzar and the days of King Darius and King Cyrus of the Persian and Medial kingdom. It's not the days of Alexander the Great, the Grecian kingdom. It's not the days of it is in the days of the Caesars, because they're the 4th kingdom. And you'll notice that 4th kingdom is the iron, and the iron mixed with clay, and that's when the statement appears. In verse 44, and in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. In Mark 9:1 that I mentioned a few moments ago, Mark 9:1, Jesus says, there are some of you standing here who will see the kingdom come with power. Now, when he made that statement, he's either saying that the kingdom is going to be there when most people are there, or there's some really old people living today if the kingdom has yet to be arrived. And so one of the real issues you have with this is not understanding, is people not understanding that the prediction is about the church. And so that kind of fits well with the idea that when Jesus came during the time of the Roman emperors, the Caesars, that Jesus intended when he came to set up his church and to set up his kingdom, those being one and the same thing. In doing so, that was the beginning of a new regime, a new order. And it was when that was set up that all those prior to it were done away with. It's phenomenal to me that this would be revealed to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is revealing what dream Nebuchadnezzar had, which obviously was from God. And the reason for it was because he wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know that he is that head, but that these things were happening, and he was privy to something that nobody else would know. In fact, the only reason Daniel, Azariah, and Hananiah, and Mishael would know those things, that's their Hebrew names, for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they would know those things. They were the only ones that would know. This is a secret of God's that Daniel records for us so that we can understand the time frame in which God set up the kingdom. We have so many friends out there who are religious, and they're very, very sincere about their beliefs. And they have no idea that the kingdom has been set up. And I don't see why it's not so obvious because of the contradictions in their speech and how they talk about the church. In fact, how they talk about Jesus. I've heard many folk talk about Jesus as the king. How do you have a king and no kingdom? That's just not possible. And so therefore, when we talk about the church, we understand that the church and the kingdom are the same thing. And Mark 9:1, there were people living in Jesus' day who saw the kingdom come with power. As a matter of fact, in Colossians 1:13, we find the reference of the kingdom being used past tense. Well, there were people there who had been translated out of darkness and into the kingdom. You couldn't be translated into a kingdom that didn't exist. And so therefore, when you look at Daniel 2:44, it's predictive of the kingdom. It's a sad state of affairs when we don't understand what Daniel was saying here. In fact, it's interesting to me that this was made known not just to Daniel, but also to King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, as a punchline to the end of the lesson, because Drew, if he were here preaching, by the way, we're about the same size. I mean, he's taller, but he's narrower, so I think the mass is about right. See, I'm shorter and wider. But nevertheless, when you look at the rest of the book of Daniel and what Nebuchadnezzar goes through, first of all, and there's very good possibility, I wouldn't die on that hill, but you go to chapter 3 and he builds what? A great image. Wonder where he got that idea. It was several years after he had had the dream and Daniel had explained it to him, but all of a sudden he's got a big golden image. Yeah, why just be the top portion of the head? Let's make the whole thing, and I'll just be forever. Nebuchadnezzar has struggled sometimes with his power, and he was even warned. God's the one giving you this king, but you've had another dream about a big tree that's going to get lopped off. And Daniel told him, you're that tree, you're going to get lopped off because you're a little bit bigger for your riches than you need to be. And sure enough, part of the dream was, you're going to be out grazing like a cow. And it's interesting, after that dream and after the thing happens and he's finished being a cow and all of a sudden his mind returns to him, he has a very different attitude toward who God is. I'm convinced he went from a polytheist to a monotheist during the course of his reign. I believe he understood who Jehovah God was by the end of it. It took him 2 or 3 times to get a handle on it. And we'll talk much more of that after the summer sermon series because we're going to study Daniel. But what's interesting to me is that God has never forgotten anybody, and even when it's hard for people to pick up on stuff, he gives multiple opportunities to pick stuff up. Nebuchadnezzar got at least 3 shots, maybe more, that we don't know of. But we know he got at least 3 shots to know who the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Jews, was. God will give us the same kind of shot if we'll just give it an effort. We've got a kingdom today, and we're part of the kingdom. We are citizens in the kingdom. And therefore, when we talk to our friends, and they're still looking for a millennial reign, you'll hear that a lot in the teachings of premillennialism, postmillennialism, and several other of those doctrines. Folks, Jesus came to this earth, and when he came, he established his church, which is his kingdom. And people were being translated into it at the writing of Colossians. We're a part of that kingdom. Now, I'm not going to go into, I thought about doing this, and I'm going to refrain and just give you a break about going into what it's like being a citizen in the kingdom, especially the fact that we are the king's brother. And that's what Jesus calls us. I don't know whether you ever think about that or not, but I'll just leave you with that thought. If you ever think, as the plight of the Christian suffering and stuff we have to go through, and the fact it's not easy to be a Christian, oh, but wait, I'm the king's brother. I'm I'm a part of the royal family because I belong to Christ. I don't know how you can take the kingdom away from the concept of being a Christian today. It takes so much of who we are from the picture. So if you're not part of the kingdom, you need to be. If you are and have been living like the king's brother, you need to change your life and live that way. And we invite you to the song we're going to have led to us by Ronnie. Why don't you stand?